Hey Adam, so today let's talk about what you do when you're getting ready to let an employee go, or an employee has come to you and wants to quit. What do you do then in terms of employment? And we'll talk about IP as well.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a very important discussion because how an employee leaves can also potentially lead to the potential claim, right? People don't talk to lawyers, generally speaking, while they're happily employed. They generally talk to lawyers when they're unhappy by their departure or they're just no longer working there. That goes with the government as well. So it's important to have a process for how you offboard an employee if it's even the appropriate time to do so. I always say if you're getting ready to fire an employee, call someone like me, spend 5 to 10 minutes with me. Let's make sure you have all your ducks in a row and to make sure that there's no risk associated with terminating the employee now. Some things that we'll evaluate are, is the employee recently dealing with a medical issue, a pregnancy, recent workplace complaint, workers' comp claim, coming from protected leave, something like that, which would add risk to the termination. And maybe we decide now is not a good time. Okay, so we explore that. Assuming it is a good time, assuming I give a blessing on a termination, then the next thing you want to look for is, how do you, from a logistics standpoint, offboard an employee? Well, you want to make sure you're disconnecting them from all your systems so that they can't possibly do any further work for you, which may be compensable, and maybe they can't cause any damage to your organization by taking data or sending it to inappropriate places. So you want to have a system in place to disconnect them. I'm sure you'll talk a little bit more about that with the IP side of things.
What
And
what
then
are the things that what are the biggest risks that you see? Like what are the things that end up in fights the most often?
I think what ends up being litigated is, you know, perhaps a company that didn't have that call that I talked about with someone like me, which is maybe a company didn't understand that it was important, or that there could be a risk associated with terminating someone who just told you that they're pregnant, or someone that has a workers'
Right.
compensation injury, or someone that's on protected leave. Maybe they didn't know that that could be a violation, or they did and they just didn't care, and that can turn into a claim.
So
So
a lot of times those like passion firings, where somebody gets upset and just fires somebody on the spot and doesn't really plan it out.
yeah, exactly. That can definitely turn into something, because we're going through, we live in a very litigious society, as you know, and we're going through a very interesting time where the economy is changing, and employers, companies really need to be smart with this. They really need to do the right thing, follow the rules, and make sure you have all your ducks in a row so that you can minimize the threat. Okay,
Right.
that's not to say someone can't just sue you, right? Because people can sue you if they have a pulse and a filing fee. That's all they need. But you want to minimize the risk. Okay. You want to handle things professionally and amicably too. Okay. So communication is key, and maybe having a witness in the room if you're communicating to the employee is also key. So that's for the terminations. For things like resignations and layoffs, you may want to consider the exit interview, where you can learn about the employment experience. What are some things that you can do to improve things within your organization from the employee's perspective? And then sometimes during those exit interviews, you may hear something as an employer that you may need to investigate, that the employee may not have said if the employee wasn't leaving. For example, so and so is harassing all these other workers. You really need to look into that. And that's something that you're hearing for the first time during an exit interview that now puts the onus on you as an employer to investigate it. So those are things that, aside from just hearing the employee complain about your bagels on Friday and your pizza parties being excessive, um, you also can hear about things, legally speaking, that you need to take action on to improve. From there, there's logistics like returning the property that you've let the employee borrow during his or her employment, making sure that that's done, perhaps reminding the employee about any post-separation obligations, like pursuant to their contract, and then keeping an eye out on, are they filing for unemployment? And if so, are they saying the right things in their unemployment filing? Because if they're not, then you as an employer need to address that, moving forward. So there's really a lot more to it, and I actually have a 1 hour meeting with my clients to go over their offboarding processes to make sure that they're done in a legally compliant way and with best practices. But that's really like a snippet of some of the considerations. Justin, tell me about intellectual property related considerations when an employee is offboarding from an organization.
Yeah, so from an intellectual, when you're talking about intellectual property, your biggest risk is that it walks out the door, right? So you're presuming, we're presuming that you've already done the things that you were supposed to, right? To get the assignments, to get confidentiality agreements, to get all those things in place with these employees. And then comes the day that they leave, and it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes, people just move on to different jobs. But you still want to make sure that you're cutting off their access to any of your materials, right? Like nowadays, just thinking about it in our company, there are so many different tools that everyone has that it's important to cut off that access. It's not a mean thing. It's just they don't need access to it anymore. They don't want access to it anymore. And so making sure that you systematically do that for every system that you have. Another one is if you had hired somebody to do research or anything, any type of development, make sure that you have copies of all their notes. Those notes belong to you, and so you should have copies of all of those things. Hopefully in a software development scenario, they have documented everything inside the software, but any other materials that they have that help explain what they were working on, all of those things you want to make sure you get a copy of. It can be a good practice just to talk about in that exit interview, if you have one, about what their obligations are, right? Like that going forward, it's confidential what they've been working on. That a lot of these things are trade secrets that they can't ever disclose. I'm not sure that all employees really get that, but talking about it, having a culture of that is important. And then I guess another one that happens far too often, and this actually probably happens more in big companies than small companies, but is making sure that before an employee leaves, you have some sort of knowledge transfer. Like whatever that employee was working on, you got to make sure. I mean, the best practice is you try to have two people know everything, right? But you want to make sure that if you have a key developer or a key person who's working on stuff, when they leave, somebody else understands what they were working on. Somebody else knows and can carry it on, because otherwise you'll have to recreate it. Like all of that knowledge will be gone if it's not documented. So those are kind of the four things that I would focus on for my P.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me, Justin, like you can't really just send somebody on their way, that there needs to be this orderly process to have an employee depart, or else you may lose some of that data and you may lose some of those protections that you work so hard during the employment arrangement to protect, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it happens, you don't even realize it's happening, right? Because a lot of times it's time for a change, so everybody's looking at that aspect, but then you don't realize until later that, like, wait, that person had 10 years of learning in this particular ecosystem, learning these particular skills, and not just the skills, but those as they apply specifically to your business, and getting that knowledge transfer is really important.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the takeaway from both of us is, it doesn't behoove a company to send an employee on his or her way in the moment, in the moment's notice. There does need to be some of these offboarding processes in an orderly fashion, and certainly having that communication with us as attorneys we can help the company stay in line with those responsibilities, right?
Absolutely.